Ladies and gentlemen, may I call the meeting to order? And first of all, welcome you on behalf of the Danube Institute. We are in for what is a most unusual treat. We're normally associated with such matters as economic crises, recessions, strategic problems, international difficulties. But on this occasion, we're venturing into the field of literature and history and biography. Today, we are very fortunate in having able to discuss a new book about Patrick Leigh Fermor. Now, Patrick Leigh Fermor is famous in a number of countries, particularly, of course, this country, where his famous books about walking across Hungary and staying at the homes of distinguished Hungarians are famous, as they are indeed in England and in other countries. He's famous, of course, also for another reason in Germany, which is to say that as a British commando in World War II, he and a colleague kidnapped the German general in charge of the German troops in Crete and took him across the island at night until they reconnoitered and until they met with a British submarine and the general was taken to Egypt. Of course, this was itself a remarkable achievement, though one, I suppose, to which his early walking holidays in Hungary may have contributed. One of the most interesting aspects of it is that the general gave his word that he would not try to escape, which he kept. What he did do, however, was he tried to leave as they walked across the island at night. He would pick a little something from his uniform, or a button or a thread, and leave it as a way in which, for the German army, and the German army was covering the whole of the island trying to find him, in order for them to pick up the track and catch him before he was spirited away to Egypt. He did this consistently through the trip, and when they got to the island without the German army capturing him, he said goodbye to the general, and when he did so, he gave him all the little bits and pieces that the general had left across the island. So he was a remarkable man, and a remarkable man in many ways, remarkable in literature, obviously remarkable in war, remarkable in courage. And we're very fortunate in having a first-class biographer in Michael O'Sullivan. No relation, though I gather we're kinsmen, and cousins, as Michael says, who has had a most distinguished career in journalism and literature, connected both with this part of the world. He has lived in Budapest for some years, and secondly, of course, his native Ireland. He and I were at different times on the staff of the national broadcaster, Radio Televisión, and he has also worked, as I did, for the major British papers, like he worked for The Independent in Vienna, and I for the Telegraph and the Times at different parts of the world. So it's a great pleasure to meet somebody who, while we've been living here in Budapest, has become a good friend and a guide through many aspects of Hungarian life which we might otherwise not have understood or known about. Michael is, of course, the center of a large and loyal circle of Hungarian friends, some of whom are here today, and we welcome them. The fact his Irishness and his background as the author of biographies of Sean Lemass and Mary Robinson is reflected in the very welcome presence of Pat Kelly, the Irish ambassador. Welcome. And there are many other people in the audience who have links with him and with the subject. And again, I'd like to particularly recognize Dagmar Fischer von Melker, who was a friend of, whose husband and who herself was a friend of Patrick Leigh Fermor, and indeed a guide to him and to many other English-speaking authors who came to this part of the world. So again, may I particularly welcome you and hope you enjoy the occasion. Thank you. I'd also like to mention two guests from Australia, Tim and Helen Andrews. They're both good friends from the time I spent in Australia, and Helen's right to be here is based on the fact that she is a brilliant writer, and I hope that points in the evening. I mean, I read about half a page of an article she sent in on spec, and I said, let's get that girl right away before somebody else does. And we managed to get a very strong piece on the odd topic of Australians in Siberia. It turns out the connections between Australia and Siberia are much deeper than you might imagine. She will tell you more. Tim is an Australian, been very active in political life there, whose original background is from Russia before the revolution. And again, you will find, Tim, in the audience, many people who have a similar backgrounds, though transferred from Russia to Central Europe and particularly Transylvania. So we have a very interesting group of people here today, and I'm sure there are people, there are other people whom I haven't mentioned, and for that, if I have failed, I apologize. But the other speaker on the platform, apart from Michael, is Dr. Tom Barchai. He, of course, is somebody who is here partly as an academic with that background and that knowledge, but he, of course, is also somebody whose family played a major role in Transylvania, where he has returned, and who knew Patrick Leigh Fermor. We have we have an important book. We have a great author, and we have distinguished guests to discuss the question. So I'm going to now simply say, Michael, would you like to address us, and we'll go from there.
Tom starts.
Well, I think I'm on.
You're on first, I apologize.
Thank you for mentioning that I knew Patrick Leigh Fermor, but alas, though I'm very old, I'm not that old. I mean, that would make me about 100, I think. I'm heading there, but not there yet. But I would have loved to have known him. Now, I've been told to ask a number of questions, and Michael's going to give us answers to these questions. And my first question is, Michael, you know that the physical distance between Dublin and Budapest is considerable. It's atrociously long, depending on the airline you take. But the intellectual distance that you've covered in writing this book is much further, much larger, really. How did the biographer of Brendan Behan, the expert on W.H. Auden, find his way to Patrick Leigh Fermor, an unknown 18-year-old traveler in Central Europe in 1934? And why, in particular, out of the 3 volumes, did you choose number 2?
Well, the road between Dublin and Budapest isn't quite cratered with yawning chasms, as you might imagine, mistakenly. There is so much more that unites Ireland and Hungary than divides us. Yeats, in one of his earliest poems in the early 19th century, referred to Ireland as the Hungary of the West. A great Hungarian scholar, Kadebo Tamás, has spent his lifetime trying to prove connections between Ireland and Hungary going back to early medieval times. Any of you in this room with even the vaguest interest in Hungarian nationalism will know the name Arthur Griffith and will probably know his great tractus, The Resurrection of Hungary, in which he proposes as a solution to the Irish problem, as it's been called for so long, the solution that was proposed here, namely the compromise. And had that suggestion of Griffith's worked, in my view, we in Ireland would have been saved an immense amount of bloodshed and the hideousness of sectarian division, which drove a wedge between 2 parts of our country for so long. You mention roads, and roads are emblematic, not only in Patrick Leigh Fermor's life, but in his work. Of course, roads are emblematic because he was walking the roads from the Hook of Holland to Constantinople, which is the reason we are all here this evening. And if I may have my own Robert Frost moment now and talk of roads diverging, Leigh Fermor was of the view that it was fate and not coincidence that took him down so many roads. And if you look at this first slide, which I hope is on the screen, well, I'll tell you the story of the house anyway. There it is. There it is. It was fate that took me down the road to that house as a very young man, hardly older than Leigh Fermor was when he came to this part of the world. Unfortunately, I didn't get to stay in this rather wonderful Baroque house. I got to stay in the stables, not as a stable boy, but with the family, who had then been removed from this house by the advancing Russians, who used its magnificent 18th century library for lavatory paper, who burned its glorious Baroque furniture, and who left the family with very little indeed. But they did leave them with one great thing that this class that I'm now going to talk about always had in the face of great loss, and that was with dignity. The family who owned this house were called von Musselin. In fact, the last man to occupy the house was the man who wrote the ultimatum to Serbia on behalf of the Emperor Francis Joseph. And it was his daughter-in-law I was staying with. She had befriended me when I was a young man, living in Vienna, working on a thesis on W.H. Auden. And here is this moment of connectivity and fate that so interests Patrick Leigh Fermor in his work. I am now one step removed, through meeting this woman, from all of the Hungarian nobles that Patrick Leigh Fermor met in 1934. You know the old Hungarian concept of 6 degrees of separation. It is the notion of I danced with a man who danced with a girl who danced with the Prince of Wales. Therefore, you're just one foxtrot away from the Prince of Wales. Well, I was now just one foxtrot away from all these ancient Hungarian noble families that Patrick Leigh Fermor stayed with through meeting Stella von Musselin. In that courtyard live families like the Turnentaxis, the Windischgrätz, and other Hungarian families, then in exile and known, of course, as enemies of the people. And as a young boy, mixing with them was a glorious thing, because all these buzzwords entered my head. Words like Trianon, words like Horthy, words like Bethlen, words like Teleki, words I'd never heard before, but words that have become an integral part of what I am, and words that, if they were now to be taken from me, I would feel like Jonathan Swift, that some savage indignation had rent my heart, if these were now to be taken from me, which of course they can't. The next slide is of a woman. Yes, do we have an elderly lady, as in the youthful arrogance of those days, I would refer to her as an old lady. She was in fact younger then than I am now, so such is the arrogance of youth. She's called Mimi von Marquet. She was a Hungarian in exile from her own country, declared, of course, an enemy of the people, blah, 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 prevented by Statute Number 4 of 1947 from using her title. That didn't concern her very much. But it was sitting in her drawing room in Vienna one summer's evening in 1982 that I first heard the name Patrick Leigh Fermor. The first volume of the trilogy, A Time of Gifts, had already been published. We were all awaiting the second volume. I had never heard of the second volume, or indeed of him, until Mimi started talking about this extraordinary young Englishman, or she thought perhaps Irishman, who had been walking from the Hook of Holland to Constantinople and stayed in the houses of many of her aristocratic friends in Hungary. I was then completely hooked on this man, and I began asking around about him. And the chatelaine of that previous house was the woman who explained a great deal to me about him. And so basically, Tom, in a roundabout way, that is how the road led from Dublin to Vienna to Budapest and to Patrick Leigh Fermor. And to this seat here this evening, yes.
Next question. In the 1930s, foreign travelers to Central Europe had a saying, and it went something like this. If you want to go sightseeing, go to Prague. If you want to live well, go to Vienna. But if you want to have a lot of fun, go to Budapest. Like all these bon mots, it's a bit of a stereotype and probably unjust. In 1934, on the surface at least, Budapest was still a very elegant, polite city, where the streets in the inner city at least were thronged with well-dressed people, both sexes. And so I'd be very curious to find what kind of impression did Budapest make on this young traveler. Probably hadn't seen anything like that. London, of course, was very different. And also, did he have fun?
Well, you know, Claudio Margus, in his rather wonderful book, Danube, describes Budapest as the West's illusion of the East. And what I think he's really talking about is he's trying to put Prince Metternich in his place. Metternich, of course, would have us believe that the Orient begins at the Landstrasse. I think Claudio Margus was telling us that the Orient really begins further east in Budapest. And I think what Leigh Fermor was immediately struck by was the oriental flavor of the city. The first thing he notices in Between the Woods and the Water when he arrives in Esztergom and is greeted by Dr. Gyula Glatz, the then mayor of Esztergom, he notes the oriental look of the nobles' costumes. And then he looks up at the basilica and he says, how oriental it looks. And this word Orient was very much in his head when he was in Budapest. A great friend of mine, a Turkish friend, about 10 years ago, we were standing on the Ferenc József Híd, looking down the Danube, and she turned to me and she said, my God, to think that this was once the frontier of our empire. And you know, I really felt what she meant, and that there was still, and still is, this oriental flavor about Budapest that Leigh Fermor pointed out. What did he see when he got here? Well, the first thing he saw was the Var. He had come over the Pilish and Visegrad hills, down through sleepy 18th century Szentendre, over the Rózsa Dome, down into the Víziváros, until he reached number 15, Uri utca, where he was received by a family called Berg or von Berg. And the glorious thing for a young man of that age to be received by a family like that was this. Leigh Fermor always looked up to older men because he had a terrible relationship with his father. His father had been a member of the English or British Raj, if you like, as a civil servant in the Geological Survey of India. So he was never at home. So he missed him, and he missed having a father. So what Hungary provided him with more than any place on earth was a series of father figures. And the first of these father figures was Tibor von Berg, a distinguished veteran of the First War, highly decorated, extraordinary man, who at the age of in 1926, just a couple of years before Leigh Fermor, had ridden from Budapest to Constantinople, taking the very same route that Leigh Fermor was about to take. So you can imagine how impressed this young man was staying in this house. The other thing he referred to about the house was that it contained hundreds of books. He said books were tumbling off chairs, falling from windowsills, stuffed under beds. He said, in my bedroom alone, there must have been 500 books. So Budapest also offered him the beginnings of an education. He'd been kicked out of school unceremoniously at the age of 16, a rather grand English public school, and the crime he committed was he was found to be in the neighboring village holding the hand of a shopkeeper's daughter. A very serious crime in the England of the early 1930s. I often like to posit the idea what would have happened had he been found holding the hand of a duke's daughter. Well, I can tell you what would have happened. We wouldn't be sitting in this room this evening because none of those books would have been written or none of that great life would have been lived. So back to Budapest. This cafe, of course, is on the Duna Corso. This is the New York coming up next. He went and saw all of these places. He sampled cafe life at its best before it was tragically put an end to by the communists. We'll come to that a bit later. But there is one other thing that Budapest offered him, and this was unique. He got to see two of the greatest private art collections in the world. The collection of the Baron Herzog and the collection of the Baron Hatvany, both eminent Jewish collectors who had between them in private hands some of the greatest paintings in the world, some of the greatest El Grecos in one case, some of the great modernists in the other. And he was introduced to them by a girl he fell briefly in love with called Anna Maria Miskolci. She was an art historian, a young student, a good-looking girl. He was a good-looking man. So the magic sort of happened, and that was his first great romantic affair. So Budapest also offered him romance. But it offered him a great deal more. Here is the Arizona nightclub of great legend. The Arizona nightclub survived the conservatism of the haughty regime, but it did not survive the brutality of the Nazi regime. It was a place renowned for a sort of high-class entertainment. Edward VII danced there with Edward VIII danced there with Mrs. Simpson. All the nobility and the jet set of the era patronized it. And he has left us in Between the Woods and the Water with, I think, one of the most extraordinary romantic descriptions of a nightclub anywhere in Europe. And that was the Arizona. Here are some of its patrons. Have we got this picture? Here is the house in Uri Utsa, 15 Uri Utsa, where he stayed in the Var. And this is something else he found in Budapest. This is Maison Frida, a maison spéciale, one of the great bordellos of the era, which was on Magyar Utsa. There were then, I think, half a dozen functioning bordellos still on Magyar Utsa. And in the city of Pozsony, he was, Bratislava, I'm sorry, he was advised by somebody that for a mere 5 pengos, a man can be a chevalier for a night in Maison Frida. Sadly, history does not relate whether he took up the offer or not, but I suspect that he did. Here we have the interior of the Nemzeti Casino. For those of you here who are members of London Clubland, it will be the equivalent of White's Club, a club founded for the ascendancy, by the ascendancy, but never, as is mistakenly written still today, did it exclude Jewish members from amongst its membership, though it must be said that the few Jewish members who were elected to membership were among the richer and the titled of the Jewish nobility. And Leigh Fermor, at the age of 19, was taken here for lunch by a Count Zichy, first name? Lodomir, thank you, Tom. Lodomir Zichy. So this was his first exposure to something that he would become an eminent practitioner of in London, as he became a member of the Travellers' Club, of Whites, of Pratts, and all these institutions that became such a part of his life. So I think that basically sums up something of what he was up to in Budapest.
Absolutely. Use the name, please. Oh. Sorry about that. Absolutely, it does certainly sum it up. And now going from Maison Frida, pleasant as that place must have been, to something rather more serious, and that is that the Hungary that Patrick Leigh Fermor found in 1934 was, if not in the throes of a crisis, but on the cusp of a change. Let's remember that the Depression hit this country very, very hard, especially, of course, the people who were his hosts. The landowners were particularly hard hit because of the plummeting agricultural prices. This didn't just happen here, it happened in the United States, it happened everywhere. So this was not a great time economically. The great conservative mastermind of Hungarian politics, Count István Bethlen, had resigned 3 years actually, before Patrick Leigh Fermor arrived, and that was really the end of an era. There was an interim prime minister, I don't want to bore you with various names and so on, and in 1932, a rather more flamboyant figure, a general, a rapidly promoted general, I might add, Julius Gömbös, or Gömbös Gyula, became the Prime Minister of Hungary. Now, he was a very different kind of person from Bethlen or any of the other prime ministers who preceded even Bethlen, Teleki, and so on. He was a man of authoritarian instincts, fascist tendencies, but remember that in this country, the constitutional arrangements still were a considerable block to the establishment of any kind of dictatorship or a fascist dictatorship. So though Gömbös was called Gömbölini behind his back, and you told me this brilliant little story that he was very proud of the fact that his chest size was almost the same as Mussolini's, which I'm sure is an accomplishment worthy of a prime minister. And then we see that Mr. Putin, I don't want to criticize him, but he's very proud of the size of his chest. So, I don't know, shall we be worried about politicians who expose their chests and say, well, mine is bigger than, his chest? So this was Gömbös. He was no fool. And what is very interesting, development which happened just a couple of months before Leigh Fermor arrived here, Gömbös pushed through Parliament a bill which extended the powers of Admiral Horthy. And this was the beginning of a process which was really masterminded by the extreme right and the right wing in this country, to turn Horthy, who was now heading towards 70, into a sort of fascist-type dictator, who would, of course, be manipulated by people like Gömbös from the background. When you read the law, I don't want to bore you with it, it didn't really do all that much, but it certainly increased his power. It was the beginning of this process. Leigh Fermor arrived here, I believe, in March, you told me.
No.
And on March the 15th, I believe, 1934, Gömbös, not Goebbels yet. He knew Goebbels as well, because I hadn't mentioned this. Gömbös was one of the first foreign leaders to visit Hitler in 1933. Nevertheless, in March of 1934, Gömbös goes to Rome, where he and Chancellor Dollfuss of Austria, together with Mussolini, sign a tripartite agreement of collaboration, cooperation, economic and political foreign policy cooperation. But what is interesting about this is that the aim of this particular agreement was to stop Nazi German expansion towards Austria. And Mussolini at that time was not yet a friend of Hitler's. He was very interested in building up this bloc of states in which Austria and Hungary played a part. Basically, their role was to be satellites of Italian policy. And we all know what happened to Dollfuss later on that year. Patrick Leigh Fermor mentions it. So I don't want to go on and bore you with Hungarian politics in the early 1930s, but nonetheless, this was a period of turmoil and change. And the storm clouds, which would eventually unleash their storm upon this country, were already being formed in the sky. But yet when you read Patrick Leigh Fermor's account of his stay here, there is not the slightest trace of what was going on in the background. He seems impervious to anything political. I mean, occasionally there's a throwaway remark. I mean, when he hears of Dollfuss's assassination in Transylvania, mentions it, but really only between two cocktails at the hotel in New York, which he claimed were the best cocktails in the world. How do you explain this intelligent young man? He knows so much about history, he's so eager to find out about history. He wants to know all about the families, the prehistoric history of this country, the barbarians of various shades, and yet seems to have absolutely no interest in what was going on around him. How do you explain that?
Well, it's very easily explained. He was completely apolitical. He had absolutely no interest whatsoever in the politics of the era in which he traveled. He once said of himself that he described his being apolitical as rather being like bisexual, that it doubled your chance of a date on a Friday night. And I can see what he means. He, of course, was rather exclusively heterosexual, so I'm not at all sure he knew what he was talking about. But he rather curiously ignored every single political event of the era, even writing with the benefit of hindsight. Because remember, this book, Between the Woods and the Water, was written 52 years after he'd been in Hungary. Now, he had the great benefit of knowing Rudi Fischer, who filled in all the missing gaps in his knowledge of Hungarian politics, in his knowledge of Transylvania, in his knowledge of the aristocracy. And you can see at work in the book, particularly when you look at the 400 letters between these two rather fascinating men, you can see how Rudi Fischer was the real guiding force that worked behind the book. And he said in his preface to the book that his debt to him was inestimable. But Jan Morris, in a foreword she wrote to Between the Woods and the Waters, said, she pointed out this fact that, of course, he was completely apolitical. When he was in Greece in the 1960s, and when the trouble in Cyprus erupted, he was at a lunch with John Julius Norwich, who, of course, has just died this week. And they were sailing around, and they reached some island, and they got out a boat, and they went to have lunch. And the local fishermen at the adjoining table heard them speaking English, and they were rather annoyed at these English people being in Greece at this time, and they let them know it. And it got rather into a messy situation of a bit of pushing and shoving, and then it settled down. And then suddenly, the Greek fishermen began to sing, and Leigh Fermor said to the crowd at his table, "Silence, it's the national anthem, on your feet." So they all stood up, and Leigh Fermor joined in the singing of the national anthem. But he went one step further. When the Greeks had stopped singing, because of course they didn't know all the verses, which of us knows all the verses of our national anthems? Leigh Fermor kept singing on because he knew all of them and in fluent Greek. So in this regard, you know, he had a keen awareness of what it must have been to understand politics, but he just wasn't interested. And sometimes he is unfairly compared to W.H. Auden and Christopher Isherwood when they were in Berlin in the late 1920s. And these people were astute political observers of what was going on around them, the rise of Nazism, etc. But Leigh Fermor wasn't. I think comparisons in this instance are invidious, and certainly comparisons between even someone as clever as Leigh Fermor was. He was not at the level of genius that I would hold Auden. But the basic answer to your question is that it was a complete lack of interest.
Well, I'm sure there are lots of people today who thought that way. 18-year-old. Oh, that's again. 18-year-old boys today are no more interested in politics, on the whole, I think, than he was. So,
Could I just get one
Yes,
other point
yes.
in, and that is this man, Paul Teleki, of course, who by the time Leigh Fermor stayed with him in 1934, he'd already been foreign minister and prime minister of Hungary. But Leigh Fermor went to see him no less than 7 times in his rather wonderful palota on Varismati ter, on the corner of Nador ter. And he never once mentions that this man had been prime minister and foreign minister. He only talks of him as having had one of the greatest libraries he'd ever seen. He talks of him as the man who mapped the Japanese peninsula. He talks of his ancestor, Samuel Teleki, as the great collector of books in Marosvásárhely. He talks of him as a great scout leader, but never once does he mention that he was a great politician.
it's incredible, isn't it?
Yes, that is just further to prove the point of his lack of interest.
Well, I suppose some of us don't have a political body in
This is
in our bodies, but-
the Teleki House. It's now the Bank of China. It was something else then. There is Horti Danjadzbanya, who were talking of him. So,
His powers having just been extended, he's quite happy. He's
and
signing whatever it is he
we're
signed.
very fortunate this evening because Tom's father worked in Horthy's cabinet, and he was a great friend, of course, of István Horthy.
No, he was actually a friend of Nicky Horthy,
Of
the
Nicky,
younger
Nicky,
one. No,
Nicky, yes.
István was much more serious.
Yeah. Well, maybe you might like to just say a few words about that friendship in those times, because it's rare now to find somebody who can connect us directly to that world in such a personal way.
Well, you know, Horthy's younger brother, or older, I forget now what he was, Jenny Horthy, was married to a Transylvanian, a Countess Blattland. So my grandparents met Horthy's brother before the war, you know, and nobody really heard of the admiral. He wasn't an admiral, he was not even a captain, I don't think, at that stage. And then later on, because my father's uncle was foreign minister in Blattland's first government, when my father went to the Agricultural Academy in Keszthely, then for some reason he and Nicky, the younger son of the region, were either in the same room or had adjoining rooms. I really can't tell you, but they became great friends, you know, and men about town, I think, and you know, enjoyed life perhaps a little too much. Nicky Horthy had that reputation. He also, of course, was a great polo player, not my father. And my father did tell me once that he had a very bad fall, and he sort of looked after him. But the thing was that later on he had another fall, I think, in a polo game, and he bore the traces of that for the rest of his life. He never really fully recovered. I mean, it's a very severe concussion. Even in the 1930s, they stayed quite close. I mean, there was one episode when the Queen Mother of Egypt came to Budapest, King Fuad's widow, and together with her daughter Fawzia, Princess Fawzia, who was on her way to Iran to marry the Shah of Iran, very beautiful woman, and Nicky Horthy gave a private dinner somewhere in a restaurant, and I remember my parents were involved, and you know, so that lasted. And then, of course, after the end of the war, I mean, they no longer saw each other. He once came to Toronto, actually, where we lived, and basically they didn't have an awful lot to say to each other. I mean, too many years had passed, and you know, I don't think it was like it had been before. But that was the extent of it all. István Horthy, of course, was not a playboy. He was a much more serious character. I mean, people forget he was an engineer. He worked in the Ford plant in Detroit in the 1920s, and he was a very different kind of person from Nicky. Though, to be fair to him, when it came to the crunch in 1944, when there was an attempt to leave the German side, Nicky Horthy was very much involved and ended up in Mauthausen and concentration camps. So. It wouldn't be fair to dismiss him entirely as a playboy. Well, having gone from there, let's get on to the next question, which is, again, a question that must puzzle an awful lot of readers of this book, is how is it possible for an 18-year-old boy, an unknown 18-year-old boy from England, who was traveling with a backpack through most of Europe? How was it possible for him to have had these incredible contacts, which ended up in him being passed from castle to castle, chateau to chateau, manor house to manor house, and greeted and accepted by some very grand families, some of the richest families in Hungary, and some of the oldest, if you like, noble families as well? What was his secret? What was his recipe? Because I would like to get that recipe. Maybe I could do it in France or something.
Well,
get invited from chateau to chateau.
I think Tom is a scion of an old Transylvanian noble family. You've had more than your own share of that life. Now, stop being modest. But everybody asks this question about Leigh Fermor. How did he breach the social ha-has of the aristocracy with such apparent ease? And if you want to find out, you're going to have to buy my book. No, I'm only joking. I shall share at least some of it with you. Some of it involved duplicity, though unintended duplicity. He had a mother who was a most curious creature. She was an Olympian-class fantasist, and she invented for the family this ancient Irish noble pedigree of the family of Taff, who arrived in Ireland in 1120. So they were of ancient lineage. They were created barons, earls, viscounts, before they were kicked out by Oliver Cromwell and had to leave for this part of the world, the Habsburg Empire, and immediately ingratiated themselves with the Habsburgs and became further ennobled and further grand. The name is Taff. By the time they got to this part of the world, it was pronounced Taffy. One of them was chosen as a young playmate for the Emperor Ferenc József. They were really part and parcel of royal or imperial life in Austria. And Leigh Fermor met a man in a bar, by curious coincidence, in Bratislava, called Tibor von Turkcy. And he told him that he was descended from this ancient Irish noble family, now part of the Habsburg menagerie. And he immediately started writing letters to everybody, left, right, and center, on the route that Leigh Fermor was taking, saying that this great descendant of an ancient Irish noble family is on his way to Constantinople. Help him in any way you can. And this is how he got his foot or feet under the mahogany of the aristocracy, by sheer duplicity, though, as I say, unintended. It was really his mother's fault, as it so often is. And he he had another thing going for him. He was absolutely fascinated by the history of these old families, and no detail was too small for him. No detail could bore him. When a Wenkheim or a Teleki stood him in front of a portrait and he said, well, this is my great-great-great-great-uncle who was at the Battle of Mohács. You know, he was just fascinated by this and loved it. Another thing, of course, he had going for him from the lady's perspective was he was immensely good-looking. He was described by the secretary of the mayor of Esztergom as looking like a cross between a pilgrim and Rudolph Valentino. The pilgrim, because he came dressed rather poorly with a big wooden staff in his hand, and the Rudolph Valentino, because he was so good-looking. And these really are the factors that made him welcome in these houses. And he used it to full effect. And we must be immensely grateful to him, I think, that he did, because without him, we wouldn't have such an extraordinarily complete portrait, in the English language at least, of the end of an era when the writing was on the wall, as your great-uncle would have it in his Transylvanian trilogy, for the aristocracy. So we were lucky to have Leigh Fermor.
And we must give thanks to the mother.
We must give thanks to that great fantasist. Yes, yes.
Wouldn't have happened. Now, of course, we've covered his trip through Budapest through Hungary, and once that's over, riding his faithful steed, but we may not be sure about that, Patrick Leigh Fermor crosses a border which at that point, of course, is barely 14 years old, namely the border between Romania and Hungary, and moves into what people now like to call as Transylvania, but it really was the Banat, the Partium, yes, if you like. And from there, he moves on at Zam to Transylvania. And there, I think he experiences some of the most interesting and valuable connections with Elemir Klobuchitsky, yes, whom he does name, of course, in the book as such. How do you think that he found Transylvania? Did he find a difference between the people he'd met in Hungary and the Transylvanians? Did he find a difference between their manner of living, their standard of living, if you like, and that which he encountered in Burosada and other places in Transylvania?
Well, the first thing I can say is he didn't find Transylvania as Bram Stoker found it, as a rather mystical place riven with vampires and all of that. He loathed all of that, absolutely loathed that idea of Bram Stoker's Transylvania. He found it hugely different in the lifestyles of the Transylvanian nobility and the Hungarian nobility, because the Transylvanian nobles had lost so much more land under the Romanian land reformers than the reforms than the Hungarians had. So there was a poorer quality, I suppose, of lifestyle, because it was reckoned in the 19th century that you needed 200 acres per room in your house. That was certainly the standard in the British Isles, and I think it was something similar here. And many Transylvanians would not have had that amount of land. In terms of hospitality, he found the hospitality very similar, because they were, in many ways, similar people. He, I think, was particularly taken by this house, designed by Otto Wagner, for a family called Moccsony de Foen, but by the time he arrived here, it belonged to the Telekis, and it had one of the greatest libraries in the Banat. And it was an interesting marriage, because the Telekis were, on the one hand, pure-blooded Hungarian, and the Moccsony de Foen were, whilst Magyarized, they took the Romanian side in many a battle, including many a battle in Parliament here in Budapest. And there was always this ongoing battle of wits between Count and Countess Teleki, which Leigh Fermor captures rather elegantly in the book. The house, as I say, was the first commission ever given to Otto Wagner when he was 24, 26, something like that. And rather curiously, it's designed, and the design is based on the Petty Trianon. For many Hungarians visiting the house, this must have come as quite a shock after the treaty was signed. Here is a picture of the interior as it is today. It is sadly a psychiatric home, but rather an open institution, and rather a delight to visit if you're ever in that part of the world, because they make you feel most welcome, and they promise that they won't lock you in. And this is the central atrium of the house, beneath which was this phenomenal library that Teleki had collected. But I want to ask you a question on this issue, because your family had a great estate outside Kolozsvár called Galiu, and when Leigh Fermor was passing through in 1934, your grandparents were in residence, I think.
Yes.
How do you think they would have received him? And how would your grandparents have reacted to an unknown young Englishman of this type?
Well, first of all, I think I should correct the great estate, because, of course, in 1934, there was no longer a great estate, and it never was a very great estate. I was just looking at papers that I've got, And I think we had about 1,000 acres of land, out of which 250 was forest.
That's still a great estate, Tom.
Well, Transylvanian land being what it is, in Hungary perhaps, on the oilfield it would have been more. Now, there was land reform. I think I should make a point that isn't often enough made in Hungary, because people tend to sort of lump all the land reforms together. This wasn't a communist land reform. It was a land reform undertaken by the Romanian royal government, which was, a very different kettle of fish from Ceausescu and the people who preceded him. And therefore, there was some compensation. Of course, it wasn't fair compensation. I don't want to bore you with why it wasn't, but nonetheless, there was something. What managed to keep my grandparents afloat was the fact that we had a distillery. And the distillery produced, I suppose, some pretty awful palinka for the villagers. And I think we also owned 40 pubs or something. And that was it, because on the land alone and the forests, you couldn't have kept your head above water. If Leigh Fermor had come to visit us in 1934, he would have found a fairly large house, an old, partly medieval, partly 17th century castle, really, of about 60 rooms. Keeping that up out of 1,000 acres was not easy. My grandparents were the only ones who lived there at that point. My father lived in Budapest. I think we've talked about that. Rather enjoying the life in the capital, not particularly looking forward to taking over the estate. And so in many ways it would have been different because the place was larger and all of that. There were still servants around. But in other ways it would have been very similar to what he describes in Gorasada. Evenings, not by the petroleum lamp, because we had electricity actually. We had our own generator and so on. That was rather rare. I mean, my great uncle owned, was much richer than we were, and had a larger house called Bonsida. There was never any electricity there, only kerosene lamps and candles. Now, by the way, my grandparents actually did do something that resembled the Klobuchitski's welcoming of Patrick Leigh Fermor. And he was kind of a Patrick Leigh Fermor character. In 1921, a young Scotsman called Douglas Lockhart spent several weeks with us in Yolu. My father was 16 at that point. He was a medical student, and I suppose the reason he came was because of my great-uncle's friendship with Sir Thomas Holer, who was the British High Commissioner just after the war. I think that's probably how it was arranged. Anyhow, this young man stayed with us for several weeks and wrote part of a book in Yolu called The Seeds of War. Now, everybody's forgotten that book. Everybody's forgotten Douglas Lockhart. I tried to look him up on Wikipedia. I can't find a thing. I think he ended up as a professor at Glasgow or Edinburgh. I'm not quite sure. But nonetheless, this book, The Seeds of War, went through 7 editions, and I hope that's going to be the fate of your book, Michael, between 1922 and 1925. So it attracted considerable attention. So in that respect, they wouldn't have found Patrick Leigh Fermor that unusual. But the routine would have been the same: a big house, 2 people living in it, a very nice guest room with a view of the mountains in the distance, and at 10 o'clock, lights out. No fun, no Miss Arizona, no fans, nothing. Boring as hell, I think. And if I was an 18-year-old, I would have wanted to escape very, very soon. Of course, there were compensation. There was a library with several, stacks of bookcases and so on. And you would have been happy to find a number of English books. And the Tatler. The Tatler and the Illustrated London News. Now, what on earth did my grandparents do with the Tatler? Neither of them had ever been to England, and yet they were reading about the bright young things of London there in the remote fastness of Transylvania. But that's the way it would have been if he had come. Now, let's go on to the next one. And the next question really is about a part of the book that I think pulls at a lot of heartstrings, namely this extraordinary, brief, passionate, fiery romance between Patrick Leigh Fermor and Angela, the woman he calls Angela. And that incredible, almost cinematic trip in an open car from Gorasada through roads and roads and through the mountains to Kolozsvár, to Cluj, and then back again. All this in the space of a weekend. Incredible. I don't know. I'm driving on Romanian roads today, and my God, it's an excursion even now. Can you imagine in 1934? How did he do it?
Well, I'm afraid the simple answer is he didn't do it. It was fabricated. It was made up, which is going to disappoint an awful lot of people, and I fear delight others. But Rudi Fischer lent him certain books, amongst which was Walter Starkey's Raggle-Taggle. And from these books, he was able to draw a complete and perfect picture of this part of Transylvania that he never set foot in until 1982, when before he actually finished writing the book. So he was able to retrospectively invent these wonderful moments in the Mikes house that you have so correctly identified, the great moment of the cocktail shaker in the Hotel New York, the reciprocally schismatic bells of Koloshvar, that great phrase, which is so accurate to this day. And he created this glorious fantasy. And he even, the car that he claimed to have borrowed, I found a photograph of it, was the car belonging to the Lazar family. We've got a distant relative of the Lazar family in the front row this evening. And this car he described to such perfection that we are convinced to this day that they made that journey. But such is the stuff of great travel writing. I always say about Leigh Fermor that it's helpful to suspend disbelief occasionally when reading him, or indeed reading all travel writing. The affair with Angela, who was really called Xenia Czernovich de Macha e Kisharosi, took place in this house at Zam. She was already married to one of the Betegs. The marriage had just taken place about a year prior to Leigh Fermor's arrival, but it was an unhappy liaison, and Leigh Fermor, as it were, stepped into the breach. This is the house at Gorasada today. He once described it in a letter to Devonshire as a great sort of brideshead of a place. Well, it doesn't remind me of anything like Brideshead or anything as grand as that. But, you know, such was the imagination of the man. It's now in an almost ruinous state. This is the great entrance portico, which once contained the crest of the Klobuczynskis, which Leigh Fermor pointed out was an arrow pointing up towards heaven in eternal hope. And they were living in eternal hope at that time because they were completely broke. This is Koloshvar today-ish. That is the Hotel New York in the background, Koloshvar of old, and the Hotel New York as it stands today, awaiting resurrection. It was from the Hotel New York that the Nazis planned the destruction of your great-uncle's house, because it was the Nazi headquarters in Koloshvar. And Tom's great-uncle was none other than Miklos Banfi, the great Hungarian novelist and former foreign minister. The house was destroyed because he simply wanted to remove Hungary and Romania from under the spell of Germany. Here is Rudi Fischer, who I had the great privilege of knowing in the last years of his life, and without whom I really think it must be said, and Leigh Fermor said it himself, that the debt he owed him was inestimable. The 400 letters between them should really be edited because they show in a way how the book was constructed, how he was in a way his greatest mentor, his greatest teacher. And we really are privileged to have his wife Dagmar with us this evening. It means a lot to me and to all of us who love Leigh Fermor, who love Hungarian history, who love Transylvanian history, that you should be here, and thank you so much for coming. Here is the last image of the evening, his passport reissued in Munich before he entered the lands of the crown of St. Stephen. And it is with that image I leave you, unless you have another question.
Just one final one. Michael, 3 years of work have gone into this book. You've done a tremendous amount of research, unearthed things that nobody had known about either Patrick Leigh Fermor or some of his hosts before. And there are a lot more stories in the book, so you must go out and buy it because, of course, we haven't talked about all of them. But what is your estimation of Patrick Leigh Fermor as a man and as a writer? If you could sum it up very.
Well, it's very difficult to sum up, as it was for Samuel Beckett when he was asked to sum up James Joyce, though the comparisons, I think, are slightly too grand. I'd be over-egging the cake if I gave the Beckett quote on Joyce. But I'll sum him up like this. He remains, for me, one of the greatest travel writers of the 20th century, one of the greatest prose stylists of his generation. Lawrence Durrell once referred to the magnificent and truffle style of his glorious prose. And I'd sum up by saying that he was such an extraordinary character that if I may end by quoting one of his friends who said, "Isn't it a pity that he doesn't come in pill form so we could take one when we're depressed?" Thank you very much. Now I think
Michael, I think that you should be your own chairman at this point. I'm perfectly happy to be a redundant member of the audience on the platform. So I'm going to suggest that you...
Well, just if there are any questions, that's all. Welcome to take them. Norman Stone.
A very brief but a slightly oddball one. I remember slightly puzzled to reading that book that he ended up slightly on the Romanian side. For instance, he would take the Romanian view of the Dacian origins of the Romanians seriously. I've not been able to do that, because I read the history of Transylvania and noticed that the last Roman burial was in 300 AD, and the first Romanian, Vlach, is noticed by written sources about 1,000 years later. I wonder, it's an oddball thing to ask about, but have you any thoughts?
Well, yes, I have. Unfortunately, when the third volume was published, The Broken Road, which was published posthumously, this fact emerged. And in it, he says that he preferred the Romanian nobility over the Hungarian nobility. I suppose it's a classic case of biting the hand that feeds you, because he found them more sophisticated. Their tastes were French. On their library tables sat all the recent Parisian published novels and magazines. And on the Dacian question, I think it was a moment of absurdity, because no one pushed the Dacian question more completely than that. A man who, even by the lax standards of modern psychiatry, was surely certifiable. I speak of Ceausescu. He carried that to the nth degree. I think Leigh Fermor was just happy to please his hosts on the other side of the border. He was being polite. He always avoided two things: the question of Trianon and the question of anti-Semitism. And whenever they arose, he merely fudged out of the conversation and out of the room as quickly as he could. But the Dacian continuity, I think, was just, shall we say, a moment of weakness on his part. I have no other reading of it. It is absurd, as I'll put it to you like this. It is absurd in the context of modern Romania as the Tuhar de Donnen or the Fir Bolog, neither of which I'm sure you've heard of, but the Irish ambassador would have heard of course. It is absurd in that context to a young Romanian as those concepts would be to a young Irishman.
And scholars don't take it very seriously today. And there's always been a division among Romanian historians about, and this is good on like Ceausescu as well. Who is our ancestors? Who are our ancestors? The Romans or the Dacians? And just a couple of years ago, some retired army officer refused to sign the Romanian census. He didn't want to put down his nationality because he said, the option that I choose is not there. And the option was Dacian.
Michael, I can't help feeling you've been slightly cagey this evening, because I know in the past I've heard you remarking on visits to the police archives, which does add a frisson of criminal thrill to the whole story, which perhaps you could, might we be permitted to know what you did or didn't discover and how it impacted on the subsequent contents of the book?
Well, I'm being cagey for a reason. I don't want anybody to know how I got in. But I can, of course, I published what I found. I was rather disappointed to find that there was nothing on Leigh Fermor. I expected a file at least this thick, but my hopes were dashed. When you think that the secret police who were keeping files on Winston Churchill's biographer, Martin Gilbert, and there are files there about this thick on him. They even tried to recruit him at one stage. But there was nothing on Leigh Fermor. And that really surprised me, and I thought perhaps it had something to do with his brilliance in his former career as an SOE officer, that he managed to evade them. Then I thought it might be the fact that when, of course, the files were first accessed after the fall of communism, there was a lot of internal housekeeping, but I couldn't imagine that they were particularly interested in cleaning out Leigh Fermor's files. But what I did find, of course, were the files on his close friends, particularly Xenia Czernovich and Istvan, Elmer Klobozinski. But from the Leigh Fermor point of view, it was a disappointment.
Michael, whatever happened to the girlfriend of Patrick Leigh Fermor, the beautiful Xenia?
Her story is rather tragic. She ended up a classic victim of communism. She was sent into internal exile, first of all, working on the largest rice fields in Hungary as a manual laborer. Then she was removed from there to Budapest, where she lived in a squalid one-room flat, which was part of a flat belonging to another person. And then she was sent as a house painter around Budapest. And finally, as an act of charity, they sent her to work in a factory embroidering shawls. She was driven to the point of committing murder, though it was later reduced to manslaughter. She was living in a house with this terrible neighbor who taunted her day and night and drove her to the point where she had no option but really to strangle her unintentionally, and did. Every member of the house went to the trial and gave testimony on her behalf that she did the house a favor by ridding them of this woman. And so the judge reduced the murder charge to manslaughter. She spent 3 years in jail. She was then released and went back to work in her shawl factory. She corresponded with Patrick Leigh Fermor. There's a rather beautiful letter in which she describes my once raven hair and siren looks are now reduced to that of a craggy old woman. So that was her fate. Then she died there on that street, now Pannonia Utca, then László Utca. That was her end.
Mark Higgy, a third Australian in the room. On Trianon, 14 years, of course, after that, Leigh Fermor came here. Should we be surprised at all about the warmth and hospitality a young representative of Great Britain received, given that Britain had been absolutely behind Trianon? I mean, obviously, before the First World War, there'd been a long tradition of Hungarian-British friendship, and there were dissidents, Rothermere and Churchill, etc., etc. But nevertheless, you might expect there have been some reserve, possibly in some quarters, towards a young Englishman. The question about police files was the other one I was going to ask about, and for those of us who came here in an official capacity to the People's Republic of Hungary, there would be some fascination about anything you could say about how you can sort of dig up if they've got anything on you. But and then just one final little question of detail. You mentioned on the final page that his favourite restaurant in Budapest was the Fekete Hollow.
In later years.
If that's true, there should be a plaque outside.
Well, beginning with the plaques, we've had great difficulty convincing the administration of the VAR to give us permission to put a plaque on 15 Oriutsa. It's simply on the basis that he was a foreigner and has no connection to Hungary. We're working hard at getting the mayor to change his mind, and I hope that events like this evening will help us do that. I can help you get into the Secret Service police files. There's somebody sitting in this room who I can introduce you to discreetly later. Wink, wink, nod, nod. And also, on the question of Trianon, I prefer Tom Barchide to answer that question, because I have my own views on it, and I'll talk about it, but he's much more knowledgeable on it than I am.
Well, I wouldn't say I am. But the question you raised was, why would an Englishman be so well received in Hungary? And that doesn't surprise me at all. First of all, of course, this country wanted to make friends with anybody possible because of its isolation. But that isn't the main problem. There was never any hostility to England or the British Empire here during the war. There's a famous story about the portrait of Edward VII, which stayed in place in the National Casino throughout the First World War. I think that, if anything, the Hungarian public opinion was blamed the French for everything that happened. And to be fair, and I think, again, Hungarians generally don't know this, at the very end, the treaty was a done thing, and there was very little that could be done. Lloyd George did stand up and say, we're making a mistake here. There's something we could possibly do to change it, and this is the time to do it. I think, as did Churchill later on. And the French representative of the French Quai d'Orsay, Philippe Berthelot, launched a vitriolic attack on Lord George, saying, there is no such thing as a Hungarian nation. This is a verbatim. What does it consist of? 15,000 Magyarized noble families. This kind of absurdity. So it was never aimed at the British, really. Although, of course, there were enemies at the peace conference. Seton Watson was no friend of Hungary. Now there was Nicholson and all the young experts in these various territorial commissions. But the general public didn't know about their role. And I'm not surprised at all that he was well received.
I think it's so warm this evening that we might continue the questions over drinks, if everybody would be agreeable to that.
Me intervene and say, let's continue the conversation over food and drink. But before we do that, I'd like us all collectively to thank this astonishing duo for the most civilized and interesting conversation that most of us will hear in certainly the next 6 months, maybe much longer. So thank you very much indeed, Tom. Thank you very much, Michael. And I recommend, on the basis of this, that you buy the book in order for them to sign it. Thank you very much.